Yeah, exactly, right? So what we were trying to say here was that we begin here with verse 3. This has been prophesied since the Old Testament that the Son of David was going to come. And the Son of David, going back to 2 Samuel 7, is a very specific promise to God's work with Israel. If you remember the whole book of Judges and how the whole nation of Israel is in such trouble, and the answer to that is David, who is really coming to bless Israel. So that's a very Jewish kind of thing, and Paul does say later on here, to the Jew first and also the Greek. Right? So the message here comes first to the Jewish people, but we're not going to leave it there because we're all about bringing about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles on behalf of his name. So we expand from just that original center core, that Jesus is the Messiah, we're saved by grace through faith, to the blue circle to include Gentiles as well. But then in chapter 8, we get all the way back to the green stuff here where God's going to restore the world and put it back together. Because remember, the big idea here, that was the questions were being asked in 57 AD, were things like, is God faithful to his promises? He sent Jesus, yeah, that's a good start, but Israel's rejected him, and is he going to put the world back together? Is he going to fix it? All right? And so the entirety of the gospel includes all of this. So we talked about individuals being restored to God in the red part there, communities restored to each other, the earth restored to mankind, and we talked about chapters 1 to 7, chapters 12 to 16, and chapter 8 especially, and using Israel in 9 to 11. And we're simply trying to demonstrate here that the entire book fits together in this coherent way, speaking about the gospel. So when Paul says right here, set apart for the gospel of God, what he's going to do in the rest of the book is explain that. Verse 2, this gospel which he promised, and it just keeps going on from there. And another way we know that's what he's doing here in the whole book is because when you go to the very last 3 verses of the book, if you weren't here last time, the very last 3 verses of the book are exactly identical to the first 6. They're just said in slightly different ways, but almost the terminology is all the same, right? All about the gospel and God putting it back together is all about, right? I think that's all we had to say about that. So let's get on then to, I think we are, right here. Let's just get back to the first, the first part of the chapter, and let's go and answer these questions. All right. I guess I should. Oh, those lights are off. Is that glare okay? Should we just leave those? You want to leave the drapes up? They promise not to signal people out there and be distracted. All right, let's take a look at number 2 then. Had Paul ever visited the Romans before? Does he know them? Who wants to answer this one? I also realize that's a bad question. I should have said, has Paul ever visited Rome before? And the answer to that is what? No, he'd never visited Rome before, but does he know the people here? Yeah, absolutely. How do you know he knows people here? Well, that's true. He does write to them, but what, Erica? Yeah, chapter 16. A long list of names. In fact, you know how many names there are in chapter 16? You were just guessing, weren't you? Who said that? Oh, you said. Yeah, no, they're like 32. Somebody counted them last time. Like 32 names of people he mentions, right? So he really knows these people. Now, how does he know all these people if he had never been there before? Right? Yeah, well, we know for sure in Acts chapter 18, verse 1, we looked at that, right? He meets Priscilla and Aquila, who had just been recently kicked out of Rome, and that's way back in 51 or 52. So Aquila and Priscilla probably are back in Rome by now because the Jews are let back into Rome in what year? 54, yeah, so they're probably back there. So a lot of these people are back there in the city, and he's probably met them on his missionary journeys because it's a very mobile society. So he knows an awful lot of people there, just so you know. All right, so let's get right then to question number 2. What's the meaning of apostle? And the answer is the same here as it was in Galatians. When you see the word apostle, you should think of, in one word, authority. Yeah, there's someone who has the full authority of the sender. Now, that definition is one that you should just absolutely memorize because it's accurate and it's true, and it helps you in a lot of different ways. An apostle is one who is sent with the full authority of the sender. And the reason why we don't just say the full authority of Jesus is because you're not necessarily an apostle of Jesus. Apostle is not that unusual a word. In fact, Barnabas in the book of Acts is called an apostle of the church at Antioch. Which means what? He has all the authority of the church at Antioch, which is worth something, but obviously not nearly like being an apostle of Jesus Christ, okay? Also, think of the phrase power of attorney. Did we talk about that last time? Power of attorney. You guys know what power of attorney is? It's like when my dad's 97 and he wants me to take control of his stuff because he can't do it anymore. He gives me power of attorney so that whenever I write my name, the banks and the hospitals take it as his signature, which is a pretty foundational concept here when it comes to inspiration. Why do I believe the book of Romans is inspired? Because Paul has the full authority to speak and write for Jesus. All right? Okay, then number 4, the Romans Road, and what does it imply? How many people knew what the Romans Road was before you looked it up? Okay, so did you agree that the Romans Road was this? Yes, we all on the same page? Yeah, I haven't noticed it today, but when I was growing up in the church, we always had little tracts that we would carry around with us. And God's plan of salvation was a very famous one, and Romans Road was a very common way to describe it, and it always included these 3 verses. All have sinned, the wages of sin is death. While we're sinners, Christ died for us, and whoever calls the name of the Lord shall be saved. So, if you take a look at that, what was the question? What does this imply about the gospel? Okay, and how did you answer that? What does this imply about the gospel? Did you come up with anything? Oh, come on, you guys, don't be so shy. Yeah, Karen? Once you're a Christian, you don't need the gospel anymore? Oh, okay. Because once you're saved, because the gospel is all about salvation. Yes. Okay. Good start. Anybody else want to add to it or agree with it or contradict it? You don't need to. Great. Yeah. I don't want to knock it. I don't want to speak against it, but I do just want to say something like this. It's kind of like it's all about the red part, right? And we don't quite have the whole rest of it, right? Now, again, the red part is very important, and it's not illegitimate, because in order to redeem the whole world, you've got to start with one sinner at a time. But the Romans Road is all about individual salvation, and that's, I wouldn't say that's not the gospel, but I would say that's not all the gospel. Right? All the gospel is about God putting the whole world back together as determined by Romans. So it's a good place to start, but it certainly doesn't end with just that. Okay? Where else do we want to go? Paul mentions the gospel in the first verse and defines it in the book as that, right? We've already kind of done question number 5. Right? Okay. All right. Then, question number 6, the obedience of faith. We kind of talked about that a little bit. There are 2 different ways to describe that little phrase. The obedience of faith, just like we would say the love of God. Is it God's love for me or my love for God? And obedience of faith could be understood as the obedient thing to do is to believe. So our obedience actually is faith. Or, I think better, as we described it last time, as the obedience which comes from our faith. Therefore, talking about it like this, we're talking about the obedience that shows up there. Call it good works, call it faithfulness, call it or whatever you want to, but it stems from our faith. And the main reason why I think that's true is because it does seem to be that's what the rest of the epistle is about, but also because that really, really important passage that we looked at last time, which goes all the way back to Genesis 49, right? When we talked about the scepter being in Jesus' hand and the obedience of the nations will be his. You guys remember that passage? It was on one of the previous slides. I didn't put it here again because I thought we knew it already, so I'll just leave it like that, okay? I feel like I guess a lot of this has been reviewed, so let's get on here and talk about, before we get to verse 15, let's just go back to Let's just go to the text here. And let's just work through the text here for a little bit. Where Paul says in verse 8, first of all, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you. And the reason why I put the circle the blue there is because it's something we never got to see in Galatians. Remember that? Remember, there's no Thanksgiving. No Thanksgiving for those people. They were too bad. They had to skip Thanksgiving. But in Romans, they clearly get it. First of all, I thank God, my God, through Jesus Christ for all you, because your faith is being proclaimed throughout the world. Now, again, kind of the evidence of a very of good faith on their part, but also of a very mobile society, right, throughout the whole world. For God, whom I serve in my spirit, by preaching the gospel of His Son as my witness, I continually remember you. I will always ask you in my prayers, if perhaps now at last I may succeed in visiting you according to the will of God. So he's wanted to go to Rome, but never made it. And has no idea at this point in 57 AD that he is going to win the lottery and get an all-expense paid vacation on behalf of the Roman government to get to Rome. He is a little concerned about what's going to happen to him when he gets back to Rome. And in chapter 15, he asks the Romans to pray for him that he might be delivered from the evil plans that are probably awaiting him, but obviously has no idea that through that whole providential happening, God is going to send him off to Rome on a Roman ship. So I long to see you that I may impart to you some spiritual gift. And I have here technical sense or general sense. I didn't ask you this in the questions, but when he says I want to impart to you a spiritual gift, what's your guess that he's talking about when he says that? And you can cheat and look at the text if you want to. Encouragement? Why do you say encouragement? Because of Romans 12? Yeah, there you go. I think you're right. That is that we may be mutually comforted by one another's faith, both yours and mine. So when he says a spiritual gift, he's not saying, I want to give you the gift of teaching or serving or something. It's not like he's a spiritual Santa Claus and going to pass those things out. But he's speaking of it in a very, as I said here, that's in a general sense. And he defines it right there in verse 12. But I do think he may say spiritual for this reason. I wrote it out like this. I'm not bringing a monetary gift, but a spiritual one, like encouragement, right? Not to be confused with the monetary gift I'm taking back to Jerusalem, right? Which right now he's taking a monetary gift back to Jerusalem. And when he gets there, he's going to give it to them in Acts 21. Or the financial gift I'll be asking you for later in chapter 15 to help me on my missionary trip to Spain. Right? So he's going to be asking for financial gifts later, and this is not that. He says, I want to give you a spiritual gift, that is encouragement. Just to understand what it's talking about. Because I've been wanting to come to you for a long time, but have been prevented until now. I'm a debtor both to the Greeks and to the Jews, barbarians, both the wise and the foolish. Thus I am eager to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome. Now that takes us back then to the questions. Number 7, why would Paul want to preach the gospel to people who are already believers in Rome? I switched those up, didn't I? Does it confuse you when I do that? When I put them on different screens, it confuses me. There. Okay. So why would Paul want to preach the gospel to people who are believers here? Daniel? Yeah, right. And it answers that question of, is God going to finish the program? Right. So, yeah, that's not too hard to come up with. Because the gospel at its micro level offers an individual-centered message of redemption. This is like the third time today you've seen this chart. But at the macro levels is God's story of redeeming and restoring His creation so the people can live in step with the movements of God, namely playing their roles well in the church at Rome. So he's eventually going to get to this whole thing of here's how the gospel encourages you to live. And that's a major part of what we're going to talk about. Do these people need to become regenerate? No, they already are saved, but they need to better understand how they participate in God's unfolding plan. So when you hear the word gospel, recognize that it's like this onion that has layers to it, and every time the word is used, it may not refer to all of it, maybe refer to different parts of it. Right? So if someone says, the gospel is just this one thing, or they go to 1 Corinthians 15, Christ died for our sins and was buried and the third day was resurrected. That is a good definition of the gospel of one part of it, right? But not the entire thing here. So, let's take a look at the next verse. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is God's power for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. Now, I don't know if that phrase strikes you as funny, but I put up here, Jews 1, Gentiles 0. Because remember, one of the things we said this book is needed for is that when the Jews come back and everybody's wondering, okay, who's in charge here? Is it the Gentiles or is it the Jews? And Paul very boldly says, it's God's power for salvation, everybody who believes, but to the Jew first, and then the Greeks get the leftovers. That kind of sounds like, okay, the Jews have a reason to feel good about themselves. Now, why does he say that? Why does he say to the Jew first and also the Gentiles? Ryan? Yeah, first in historical order, not in priority order. I think that's part of it. It's always been God's plan, right, to use the Jewish nation in the Old Testament to attract the rest of the world to him. So the gospel did come to them first. It doesn't mean that they are more important, but it did come to them first. So for the Jews, when they see this, they might be thinking, they're proud, but at least to the Gentiles, it's like God hasn't given up on them. Don't forget the historical order here. Now, as we move through, we're going to find the score is going to even up quite a bit, depending upon Paul's emphasis. But for here, this is a historical reality, okay? And also to the Greek. For it is God's power for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And there he says it again. Now, we've talked about the righteousness of God. Do we have another question about that? We do. Question number 8 talks about that. The righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel from faith to faith. What was my question in number 8? Was it how is that revealed? It's what? Please define the righteousness of God? Oh, well, we already know how to do that, right? And so how would you define the righteousness of God? At least the two aspects would be what? Yeah, he's morally upright and he keeps his promises because he's morally upright in his relationship to others, right? And that's kind of important too, because throughout the Old Testament, it talks about us being righteous in our relationships to others. And it basically means, are you fulfilling your covenant? Are you fulfilling your relationship with them? So sometimes I actually have a covenant. Am I a righteous husband? Am I fulfilling the requirements of my covenant? Sometimes I have a relationship just to my peer, like Cain said, am I my brother's keeper? Yeah, well, by definition, you are to take care of your brother, right? So are you righteous and fulfilling your relationships properly? So we can say it like this. God's morally upright in himself and in his relationships with others. As the creator and rescuer who wants to see the world set right again, as it was in the beginning, he has promised to do this, and his faithfulness to the promise has been called into question. So this righteousness of God is going to be revealed in the gospel, as we shall see, from faith to faith. Now, I think I asked you a question about that one too, didn't I? From faith to faith? So how many different ways can you think of what that phrase might mean? From faith to faith. From who? From red faith to blue faith, from God's faithfulness to our believing. That's a good way. Oh, from faith, from Jews to Gentiles. That would work. Somebody will come up with another one. From blue faith to yellow faith. Oh, wow. Yeah. Right. Well, in fact, since you guys are coming up with them in those terms, let me just put it like this. From faith, Paul, to Romans faith. Faith from the beginning of Christian life to the end. God's faithfulness to our faith. God's faithfulness to our faithfulness, which probably shouldn't be red, probably should be yellow, actually. Or, as this one says, God's faithfulness to our faith resulting in our faithfulness. Right? I mean, lots of different ways. Now, one of the good things about this, as you see those different emphases there, you almost always want to know, okay, which one's the right one? And you feel this tension about, oh, gosh, I don't want to choose a bad one. Well, the nice thing about this is whatever you choose up there, it's not going to be wrong. I mean, I shouldn't say it's not going to be wrong. It's not going to be unorthodox. All of those are true. The question is, which one is Paul talking about in this verse? Right? And I'm not sure about this, as I haven't surveyed all the commentaries to know, but I think probably this one might be the most popular, faith from beginning to end. Does anybody have an NIV open? Anybody have a Bible open? Or are you just sticking with the translation I gave to you? I think NIV says faith from first to last. Is that what you, Cassie, is that what you remember? Okay. Yeah, so yeah. Beginning and ending in faith. Yeah, so it's probably, I think it's probably pointing to that one. And the NIV certainly is. From faith for faith? Yeah, okay. Did somebody have a hand up? Nancy? Yes. To faith, through faith, for faith? Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what they're intending. I'm not sure. Anyway, here's what I'm guessing is probably this one. From God's faithfulness to getting us to believe so that we will then end up living lives of obedience, which stems from our faith. And the reason I say that is because I think as we move through, there is a big focus on God's faithfulness to his promises. All the way through, you see the big focus on the red faith. But you also see a focus on blue faith, our correct response of believing. And then you see a really important focus on living that out in the faithfulness. Right? So I think when he says from faith to faith, I think he's talking about it starts with God, it continues with our response to God, and then it continues with us living out that response in our actions. So we'll see more of that as we go through the book. Now, notice this. For the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel from faith to faith, just as it is written, the righteous by faith will live. Now, I put NB Habakkuk. You guys know what NB stands for? It's a Latin term, which is nota bene, which means note well. Right? Or be aware of this, don't forget this, right? Note well the story of Habakkuk and Habakkuk chapter 2. Do you guys remember the story of Habakkuk, what was going on in his day? You remember the story of Habakkuk, don't you? Yeah. Have you done it already? Have you done it? Oh, last Friday. Okay. Did you do a good job? Did he? He did? Okay, good. Good. Habakkuk is faced with this difficult situation of the impending doom, right? And God says, look, you're going to have to trust me. So when it says here, the just shall live by faith, it is talking about Habakkuk's faith in the unfailing promises of God when they look like they have failed. Sound familiar? Does it make sense to you why Paul would quote that here? It might look like the promises of God have gone off the rails, right? But they haven't, and he is absolutely going to fulfill his promises, and so you've got to trust in him. So I think even the quote here from Habakkuk probably corresponds to what we've been talking about there. So let's go next then to this. Now, did I have another question about... Question number 10, how is the righteousness of God seen in the gospel? I guess I should back up here a little bit, shouldn't I? How is the righteousness of God seen in the gospel? What did you say to that one? You're kind of on your own there. I didn't give you any hints or clues about it, I don't think. So, what did you come up with? Say that again, Andrea. Oh, okay. So, yeah. So obviously you're going to take gospel in the large sense of God fulfilling his promises from the Old Testament. Yeah. Anybody else want to add to it? Yeah. Cassie?
He's faithful to keep promises both in the sense of blessing and of curses.
Yeah. Okay. And what were we thinking about in terms of curses? Like the wrath? Yeah. Yeah. He's just, right? He's morally upright. So to be morally upright means that you reward good behavior, but you also punish sin too. Yeah. Yeah, in the gospel, God's faithfulness to his promises is seen in Christ, where he deals with moral uprightness in punishing sin and restoring the world to its original perfection. So if you want to see God being really, really righteous, watch this whole story unfold. That's kind of what he's saying. Now, notice this. One of the best places we're going to see it is when we get to Romans 3:25. Romans 3:25 is in a lot of ways the heart of the atonement, the heart of the justice of God. And notice this. God publicly displayed him at his death as the mercy seat. Now, a lot of translations actually say the propitiation. But the mercy seat, talking about the top cover of the Ark of the Covenant, is what he's literally talking about. The place where the high priest would sprinkle the blood. Right? So this place where he sprinkles the blood, where he satisfies the wrath of God, is what it means when he says the mercy seat. This was to demonstrate his righteousness, here it is again, because God in his forbearance had passed over sins previously committed. So in his righteousness, a lot of what he's doing here is punishing sin. He is morally upright. He is outraged by sin. Right? But notice this. This was also to demonstrate his righteousness in the present time so that he would be... Now here's the weird thing. If you're looking at this in Greek, all that stuff in red is the same word. We just change it because it's hard to get... We don't have a word righteous fire. Right? Like we have justifier. But that's the word. Again, this is part of our problem being English speakers, not Greek speakers. Right? Same thing with pistis and faith and faithfulness. The same thing is true here. And the reason why we put justifier and just is because those are the same words. But it's nice to be able to say, okay, he's just in that he's judging sin, but he's also the justifier, forgiving sin for the one who has faith in Jesus, right? Or because of Jesus' faithfulness. But if you wanted to read this carefully, you could say, this is to demonstrate his righteousness because he punished sin on the cross. He didn't make Abraham pay for his sin, but punished Jesus for Abraham's sin because he looked over the sins previously committed by Abraham. Right? So to demonstrate his righteousness in the present time so that he would be righteous and the righteous fire of the one who lives because of Jesus' faithfulness. Right? So that's kind of the heart of the being moral upright and keeping his promises, but it's also, we're going to see it expanded even into chapter 8 and 9 to 11, all that stuff too. So, I think that's all I want to tell you about that. All right. Let's go on then to this, the wrath of God. So, fun stuff here. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness. Now notice, it's too bad there's so much space between these things. Notice the parallelism between the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel to the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. Right? Because wrath is a part of righteousness here. Revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of people who suppress the truth by their unrighteousness. Now, what we're going to see here, of course, is some of the wrath of God that is poured out against people who have committed the sin in chapter 1. But remember that the ultimate way the wrath of God is poured out is ultimately in chapter 3, the verse that we just saw. So God's wrath is nowhere more clearly seen than in chapter 3 at Calvary on the cross. There's a little bit of that wrath going on right here, right, individually, but nobody gets it nearly as bad as Jesus does there in chapter 3. But there's a small portion of it revealed here from heaven against ungodliness and unrighteous men who suppress the truth by their unrighteousness. So what is the basic error here in these verses? And I hope it's not too hard to figure out if you looked at the outline. By the way, the outline can be half of the answers for the questions in the class from now on. So you'd be really, really well advised to look at the outline carefully. So what's the basic error of these people? They're what? Yeah, exactly. They're truth suppressors. Now, what does that phrase imply? If you suppress the truth, make some observations for me. Just tell me what does it imply? They already know it. Number one. Keep going. It's what? What do you mean limited? Well, it doesn't say they conceal the truth. It says they suppress the truth. Think about the exact verb of suppress. What kind of things would you have to suppress? What, Rachel? Exactly, something that's popping out all over, right? One of the best illustrations in my head is, like, remember in the summertime if you're in a pool and you have a bunch of beach balls? You ever try to keep 5 of them under the water at once? But that's the kind of word that this is. Suppression involves pushing down stuff that's trying to pop out. And if you're not careful, you lose it and it just pops out everywhere. And what's really amazing about this is that I think all of these verses hang together because they're explaining suppressing the truth. Do you understand what I'm saying? How do we know they suppress the truth? Well, because it's totally obvious, right? Which is where verse 19 goes. Because what can be known about God is plain to them. Why? Well, because God has made it plain to them. So the very fact that there are, it's plain, is evidence about the fact that they have actually suppressed it, right? You wouldn't have to suppress truth that's hidden. You could just ignore that or not even know about it. But if it's busting out, that means you have to keep pushing it back down. So the basic error is, in fact, this. And what is the truth which they are suppressing? Now, boy, I hope I can communicate this clearly. I hope you caught it clearly from the text. But it really is pretty obvious there once you start digging into it. What truth are they suppressing? Righteousness of God? Well, that might come from before, but just looking at these verses, what truth are they suppressing? Well, yeah, if you want to go back up here, it would be the gospel, but look at verses 19 and 20. Yeah, a lot of it is who God is versus the cheap substitutes, right? But look at this. I really do think that verses 19 and 20 are explaining the word suppress. You can only suppress stuff that is busting out, and 19 and 20 say that it's busting out. What can be known about God is plain to them because God made it plain to them. Since the creation of the world, his visible attributes have been clearly seen because they are understood through what has been made. So people are without excuse. So notice the cute little oxymoron that Paul uses there. Everybody always wants to point it out. His invisible attributes have been clearly visible. Okay? Kind of making a little bit of a pun there, a little play on words, but you get the point. Right? So explain to me what you can know about God from looking at the creation. Obviously, he says eternal power and divine nature. Can you give me a couple of examples of where you're going to see the eternal power of God in creation? I mean, you can think of it as a 21st century person, and that's true because the more we know about science, the more amazing stuff we know. Not only as you go on a big scale of looking at the universe and the galaxies and the Hubble telescope stuff, but also when you go on a small scale and look under things like the microscope and you start figuring out chemicals and how babies are born and how cells function, that sort of stuff. You see really, really amazing stuff about God. But try to put yourself back in the first century when they didn't have that kind of stuff. How could they have seen the eternal power of God? Natural disasters, for sure. I mean, the power in an earthquake, the power in a hurricane, the power in a tornado. Anybody been in any of those kind of things? Anybody here been in one of those? What were you in? 8.0. That'll shake you up, I suppose, huh? How old were you? 16. You remember it pretty well? Yeah. Kind of scary to feel it, huh? Okay. That's some of the power. What about the divine nature? Where would you see the divine nature? Where would you see examples of what God is like in nature? Yeah. Yeah. The beauty of nature and how things function. There has to be an intelligent designer. There's also one other thing we often overlook in this. How else would you see God's personality in nature? Yeah, through humans, right? Through what has been made, and we've been made, right? So as you see people in the creative, emotional, complex way we are, it'd be hard to think any less of what God is like. And again, Paul says in Acts 17, doesn't he? You should not think that God is like gold or silver, but he's like us. We are his offspring, as your own poets have noticed. Okay, so you see all that stuff, and I would argue that 19 and 20 explain to us why it is suppressed, because it's obvious, but I think the actual truth is probably more like this. Although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or give him thanks. So I think as you put this all together, I'm going to just kind of be a bad teacher here and tell you what I think before I've asked you what you think, but I think you put this through with the next chart we're going to look at. I think that the basic truth they're suppressing is simply that God is God. Anybody come up with that already, or something like it? I think it's that simple, that God is the one who deserves to be on the throne. And they've suppressed this truth because if you just look around you, you will know that there is a God much bigger than you are who created things and therefore owns things, and he's supposed to be worshipped and you're not. And if you think about that, you will glorify him as God and you will thank him for his goodness in giving you life. So, is the problem here perception? And the answer is no. The perception is clear. What's the problem? It's the decision to not acknowledge him as God, right? Which is why God's wrath is poured out, which is why he holds them accountable, which is why we are without excuse, because we know better, we just choose differently, okay? So when we talk about the effects of the fall, it is not right to say that we just can't perceive anything clearly. You can see all kinds of stuff just through general revelation. The effects of the fall are probably more focused on your decision maker, on your willer, than they are on your knower. At least according to this, right? And so it's not that you didn't recognize truth, it's that you saw what was true and you determined to push it back down. No, I'm not going to put God up there. I'm going to replace God, which leads us to our next. How do they suppress truth? Easy answer. You look at the outline. What's the answer here? How do they suppress the truth? Methods of suppression, right there. Number one, rejecting God. And number two, replacing God. Yeah, exactly, okay? So they reject him. Although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or give thanks, became futile in their thoughts, and their senseless hearts were darkened. And then over here, replacing God, they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for an image resembling mortal human beings or birds or four-footed animals. Now, the next question, 13, was this, the little chart. So, did you get the chart filled in? Okay. Now, the reason I wanted you to fill in the chart is because I didn't really understand this passage as well as I do now until I filled this chart in myself. And I don't know if you came to the same conclusion I did, but let's see here. What did you put in their problem in versus what they usually did in 21 to 24? Yeah, they didn't glorify him as God, right? They did not glorify him as God or give thanks, verse 21. And they exchanged the glory of God for the image of man and beast. So they took God away from his rightful place and put something else in his place. They didn't let God be God. Right? So God gives them over then to sexual immorality. Now we'll talk about that in a second, but I want to get back to the chart here. In 25 to 27, what do they do? Yeah, they exchange the truth of God for a lie. So explain this then. What is the truth of God? Now let the context help you out here. What does it mean to exchange the truth of God? And don't make it any harder than it actually is. Yeah, the truth that he is God, right? The truth that God is God and you're not. And what are they given over to? Yeah, it's basically homosexuality, okay? The last one, what is the very last one here? (28 to 32). The what? Well, hate is what they're doing, what they're given over to, but what do they do? Exactly. They didn't see fit to acknowledge God. And were given over to exploiting other people. Now, we'll get to these things and some other things later. But what I want to focus on this, first of all, is the stuff here in the left-hand chart, left-hand side of the chart. Do you see a distinction between the stuff on the left-hand side of the chart, the various levels there? Kind of repeats the same idea, doesn't it? See, that's the part that kind of dumbfounded me at first, because I expected that these were three different levels or something you go to, or the left-hand side was connected to the right-hand side, and if you did that thing on the top, then you got that thing on the top right, and if you did the middle thing on the left, then you got the middle thing on the right, or if you did the lower left thing, then you got the lower right thing. And the more I did it, I realized, wait a minute, these are not three different things. It's just three different ways to say the same thing, which is, going all the way back to 1:18 and 19, they suppress the truth that God is God. Now, I think this is really fundamental to the understanding of sin, because in the first three chapters, we're going to deal an awful lot with sin. Right? We're going to kind of climax in chapter 3 with what sin is. There's none righteous, no, not one. They've all turned away to their own ways, and the mouths are full of cursing and bitterness, and their throats are open graves, and their feet are swift to shed blood, blah, 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 blah. But I think what's so fundamental about it is right here where Paul says, okay, when you want to know where it all starts, here's where it all starts. You don't let God be God. And when you don't let God be God, and you don't put God at the center of the universe, and you don't acknowledge him as God, and you don't glorify him as God, and you don't give thanks to him as God, and you try to replace him with something else which isn't God, this is where the fundamental flaws start. This is where sin starts. This is why God's wrath is out there. Not because people's feet are swift to shed blood, but because before they did that, they broke the fundamental law of taking God off the throne, out of the center of the universe. And I think that's what's going all the way through 1:18, all the way to 32 here. Okay? The fundamental idea is you're not letting God be God. Now, when they do this, it says we're given over to these things. And maybe the best way to answer that is to go on to this next question. Are these three different types of bad sinners? And I don't know how you answered that one, but for lack of time, I'm just going to answer it here, okay? And I'm going to say this. I think these are three different ways in which God has allowed people to have what they want as they've gone against the intended structure of creation. Think of these ways of God saying, okay, you're not going to acknowledge me as God? You want something else? Okay, I'll let you have it. Think of the prodigal son. I think the prodigal son fits this perfectly, right? The father says, okay, you don't want me. You want to go and have your own way? Okay. And the father lets him go. Now, why does the father let him go? And why does the father go wait at the end of the driveway every day? Because he knows when the boy gets what he wants, he's going to say, whoa, this is pig food, and come back to him. So the wrath of God here, I think, is this kind of redemptive sort of wrath where God says, okay, you want that, I'll give it to you, and we'll see what happens, see if you don't, in fact, come back to me. I think it's kind of a redemptive approach. Okay, you don't want me, you can, these three different things can happen to you. I'll talk more about that in a second. Letter B. Is there a correlation between what they did and what happened to them? And my answer is this. I don't think there is. And when I say that, what I mean is, I don't have the chart up there, do I? I don't think you're doing different things on the left-hand side which deserve exactly what's on the right-hand side. I would say this. They actually all do the same thing, which is reject God as God, but there are different consequences. When God is not at the center, life will go out of control, and these are three ways out of a possible 522 that I found up to this point personally, human life has run off the rails. So let me go on to this next chart I want to show you to explain that. I think the point of what's going on here is this. The conception that Paul has in his mind is this. As God creates the universe, obviously He is the center. He's the creator. And if you don't want to acknowledge that He's the creator, you can go far away from Him to sexual immorality or to homosexuality or to a twisted mind. But those are just three examples that we could fill in like this and say, okay, you could be disobedient to parents, or you could be a murderer, or you could have pride in your life, or you could be deceptive, or you could be slothful, or you could be gluttonous, or you could be greedy. And the thing that all of those things have in common is that if you go for them, it takes you away from the center. Right? Or we can say it like this. If you happen to be a glutton and you put gluttony here in the center, what you do is you kind of kick God out. And he's out here. He's kind of barely visible, but He's out there. Now, what I'm trying to demonstrate by this chart is the central idea that God is at the center, and the fundamental error is not letting Him be there. And there are a million different ways to do that. In fact, when you get over here to this twisted mind, this was the last one, right? The depraved mind. You notice that I actually had to steal some of the specific ideas from 28 to 32, like disobedient to parents and murder, right? And I just kind of picked out the other ones, but all of them are simply, I was trying to think of ways to explain it, and if you put God in the center here and you kind of have a rope tied to God, as you walk away, you pull Him off the throne to the outside of anything. And it doesn't matter which one of those things you go after, you end up taking Him off the throne. So let me go back to this previous slide then and say something like this. Is this a sequential thing? And the answer is no. When we go down from first, second to third, one doesn't have to become heterosexually immoral before one becomes homosexually immoral, before one finally becomes disobedient to parents. That's why I think it really does kind of fit like this, okay? And the fundamental idea here is not letting God be God. Now, I'm sorry it took me so long to get there, because really what I want to do is to quiz you about this and let you think about this. What does this mean then for a presentation of the gospel? Number one. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the simplest way to get to it, number one, right? Instead of talking about individual sins, let me just say, okay, let me say here, the biggest problem is you're not letting God be God in your life. Really? Well, yeah, and actually that kind of puts God at the center of the whole conversation, right, in the beginning point of the conversation. Number two, let's think about, even though all of us, as we're going to get to chapter 3, even though all of us here have been saved from the wrath of God in Christ, we know that all of us still sin, right? So in some sense, even though we're not this totally lost generation of which he's speaking there, because our redemption isn't complete yet, we still sin. And when we sin, you tell me, how does this show up in your life? I mean, do you realize that every time you've sinned, what have you done first? You've taken God off the throne. You haven't let God be God. And one of the ways I think that we should think about our own lives is we should say to ourselves, okay, let me take inventory here. Are there areas in my life where I have deliberately taken God off the throne and he is not God, where I've chosen to be God in his place? Because this is the fundamental place where sin starts. This is why the wrath of God is expressed against taking God out of the picture and replacing him with something else. Now, gosh, it's too late to have a big conversation. But what else do we need to talk about from 1:18 to 32? What other question? Maybe I won't answer now, but let's just do a list of questions that you still have about 1:18 to 32, or things you'd like to pursue in a conversation later. Yes, yeah, good point. What does general revelation do for you? And it seems unfair that it can condemn you but not save you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can talk about that a little bit next time. That's good. That's a good point. What else? Good. Yes. And you're saying, is it something which God pushes you into, or which you choose yourself? And if you choose it yourself, why does it say God gave you over to it? Yeah, good. That's the reason why I wanted to go with the prodigal son thing. Because I think in that story, you see the prodigal son initiating, wanting to go, and the father giving permission, and in that sense, giving them over to it. I don't think it means that God is deliberately punishing them in a way that they wouldn't have gotten on their own. He's simply allowing them to eat the fruit of their ways. It's like a child, this is an extreme example, so don't think of me as a bad parent, but a kid who says, I want to go play in the street, I want to go play in the street, I want to go play in the street. And the parent finally saying, okay, go play in the street. Okay, not street, sidewalk, okay? I'll get hit by Johnny on his bike, and the 12-year-old kid on his bicycle. You know, where you say, okay, if that's what you really think you want. And you understand, when you were a teenager, you probably did some of that stuff. You probably said, I want to do this, I want to do this, I want to do this. And maybe your parents didn't know about it, and you did it. And then you realize, ooh, that wasn't so good. Right? Yeah.